The drought had come in slow and mean that summer of 1887, creeping across the Nebraska prairie like a fever no one could break. The grasses went yellow by the middle of June, and by July, the creek that cut along the eastern edge of her claim had dropped to a thin silver thread barely worth following. She was 22 years old, and she had worked this 160 acres alone for nearly 3 seasons, and she had learned that the land did not offer kindness freely. You had to earn it. You had to watch it, listen to it, argue with it sometimes in the long, hot evenings when the wind carried nothing but dust. She had inherited the claim from her father, who had filed on it in 1883 and broken his health before his lungs gave out the following winter. She had come out from Missouri with $30, a team of aging mules, and enough stubbornness to embarrass a stone wall. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the women, the farmers, the homesteaders who held on when the world told them to let go. This is the story of Clara Mayfield, and a summer that taught a whole county what happens when the earth itself decides to answer a woman's silence. The leaves had started to curl at the edges, the cornstalks standing pale and thin when the sinkhole opened. She woke that morning to a sound that was not thunder, but something lower, more intimate, as if the earth itself had exhaled a long and patient breath it had been holding for decades. Clara Mayfield stepped outside into the pale early light, bare feet cold in the dust, and looked out across the field she had planted by hand in April. In the center, the earth had simply vanished. The hole was wide as a barn, its ragged edges draped with torn corn stalks and broken clods of soil. She stood at the fence line for a long moment, one hand resting on the post, counting the rows of corn gone, 40, maybe 50, and the sorghum on the southern edge slumped sideways into the depression. The losses were real and immediate and staggering. But the darkness below was not absolute. That was the first thing she noticed as she walked to the edge. A faint gray light breathed up from somewhere deeper, diffuse and cool, as though the earth had its own quiet illumination. She pressed her palm against the nearest wall of the collapse and felt it, flat, dressed. The gray layer was not natural rock, but worked limestone, cut into blocks and set with deliberate hands. Someone had built something here, built it deep and built it to last, and the earth above had simply forgotten it was there. Clara Mayfield did not panic. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury the frontier could not afford. She went back to her cabin for her lantern, her long-handled spade, and her heaviest rope. She also took a drink of water and forced herself to eat 2 bites of cold cornbread, because her hands were trembling, and a body in shock needs tending before a problem does. She tied the rope to the fence post and lowered herself down. The air changed the moment she dropped below the surface, cooler by 20 degrees, still and clean, with a faint mineral smell that lives in stone that has never seen sun. The arch was there, stone, curved, solid, a heavy wooden door, black with age, set into it. The iron hinges had gone orange with rust, but the door itself had not rotted through. She set the spade tip against the door's edge and applied steady pressure. The old wood groaned. Rust-seized hinges resisted, then gave with a sound like a single low note struck on a church organ. The door swung inward. The lantern light moved across a stone floor, stone walls, and a ceiling that stretched further back into the dark than she could yet see. She spent that whole day below. The first room was perhaps 20 feet across, the walls dry-stacked limestone fitted with a patience that spoke of someone who understood stone the way a seamstress understands cloth. Along the far wall, wooden shelving built into the rock itself, empty now, but the spacing between each plank generous enough for crocks, for wrapped hams, for barrels set on their sides. And on the left-hand wall, a second opening, a passage, low and dark. She did not go further that day. She had a lantern with oil enough for 2 hours, and she had learned that a woman who survived on the frontier was a woman who knew the difference between courage and foolishness. But she came back the next morning with a fresh lantern, a longer rope, and her journal. She measured the first room by pacing it, 16 feet across, 12 feet deep. She noted the height of the hooks from the floor, the direction of the passage. Then she entered the passage, stooping low, one hand trailing the stone wall. The second chamber was larger, the ceiling arched overhead in a pale, uneven curve, the walls glistening in the candlelight. And along the far edge, barely audible beneath the silence, she heard water. Moving water, slow and steady, as reliable as anything she had ever heard in her life. She moved toward it the way a person moves toward a fire in winter, not rushing, but unable to stop herself entirely. The water ran in a channel cut deliberately into the limestone floor. Straight lines, intentional angles, nothing that water alone would have made. Someone had guided this flow, redirected it from wherever it entered the earth. She touched it with 2 fingers, cold enough to ache. She tasted it, clean, tasting of stone and depth and nothing else. She sat back on her heels and understood. This was not a root cellar. This was a working cold storage room built below the frost line, with a live spring feeding a cooling channel. On the right-hand wall, she now noticed a row of shallow depressions carved into the stone, each roughly the size of a wash basin, evenly spaced, connected to the water channel by tiny carved grooves. Cooling basins, she thought slowly. For crocks, for butter, for milk and cheese, and anything else that turned in summer heat. Her throat tightened. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. She had spent 4 summers fighting spoilage, and all that time this had been here waiting, patient as the limestone itself. She pressed her back against the cool wall and closed her eyes for a moment. And then she made a decision that would set the whole valley whispering. She decided she would not sell her land. She would not leave. She would rebuild the collapsed shelves, seal the crack in the ceiling, and fill every room with the harvest she intended to grow and store. She would plant an orchard in the depressed bowl around the sinkhole, where the cooler air and the water channel would give the young trees a chance the open prairie would never offer. Her neighbors would call it the folly of a lonely woman, but Clara Mayfield had seen what the earth kept, and she intended to use every inch of it. The news spread across the valley faster than a prairie fire. By the time Clara Mayfield had finished clearing the debris from the 3rd underground room, the story had already passed through every porch and general store within 20 miles. A woman alone, living on a failed claim, had watched her corn crop vanish into a hole in the earth, and instead of packing her wagon and heading back east, she had started planting trees in the depression. Young apple and pear saplings, hauled from the nursery in Hastings, at a cost that made the storekeeper lift his eyebrows and say nothing. People shook their heads. They had seen hopeful homesteaders before, men mostly, who came out with grand plans and left within a season, their wagons sagging with disappointment. But a woman, a young one at that, spending money she did not have on trees that would take years to bear fruit, in ground that had just swallowed half her field. That was a different kind of foolishness. That was the kind that got talked about over supper tables, and whispered about at church socials when the preacher was not listening. Her closest neighbor, a man named Jonas Crane, was the first to say it aloud where she could hear. He came riding up the lane on a Tuesday afternoon, his mare favoring her left foreleg, his hat pulled low against the sun. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked at the pile of limestone she had hauled up from below, at the young trees standing in neat rows around the sinkhole, at her face, which was streaked with dust and patience. "Miss Mayfield," he said, and the way he said it made her name sound like a diagnosis. "I hear you've been digging." "I have," she said. She did not offer anything else. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. "This land is hard enough for a man with a family and a team of good horses. For a woman alone, it is not just hard, it is cruel. You have lost your best field to a sinkhole." "That is a sign, Miss Mayfield, a sign that the land does not want you here." She looked at him steadily. "The land does not speak in signs, Mr. Crane. It speaks in seasons, and I intend to be here for the next one, and the one after that." He laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a tired one, the laugh of a man who thought he was witnessing a child insisting the sun would rise in the west. "You'll be gone by November," he said. "They always are." He touched the brim of his hat and turned his mare back toward his own property, leaving a quiet and a dust that settled slowly over her young trees. Clara watched him go and then went back to work. She had no time for arguments. The map she had found in the leather bundle showed a second entrance in the northwest corner, near the low, brushy rise with the limestone outcropping she had walked past 100 times. She spent 3 days clearing the brush, cutting back the sumac and the wild rose that had woven themselves into a barrier no one had bothered to push through. On the 4th morning, she found it. A slab of limestone set into the hillside, so perfectly fitted that only the faint line of its seam gave it away. She worked a pry bar under the edge and leaned into it with her full weight. The stone shifted, then slid, then grated open on some hidden pivot, revealing a narrow staircase cut into the earth, descending at a gentle angle into the same darkness she had come to know below. She went down with a lantern and found herself in a passage that connected to the 3rd vaulted chamber, the one with the domed ceiling and the long stone shelf. The second entrance was dry and solid, protected from the weather by the overhang of the outcropping above. It meant she could move supplies in and out without using the sinkhole, without anyone seeing. It meant she could work below in private, without the neighbors watching her every descent and drawing their own conclusions. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and felt, for the first time since the collapse, that she had a true advantage. Not luck, not charity from the earth, a piece of knowledge that belonged to her alone, earned by the risk of trusting her own eyes when the ground gave way. She began stalking the rooms in the weeks that followed, moving quietly, working by lantern light in the cool underground air. She sealed the crack in the ceiling of the second chamber with a mixture of lime mortar and crushed limestone she had prepared herself, pressing it into the fissure with her fingers and smoothing it flat. She scrubbed the stone shelves with a stiff brush and water from the channel, removing the dust and the faint chalky residue of decades. She hung new iron hooks in the first room, driving them into the existing holes where the old ones had rusted away. She carried down her own stores: crocks of salt pork, sacks of dried beans, barrels of flour, coils of rope, extra lanterns. She filled the cooling basins with water from the channel and set crocks of fresh milk from her cow into them, watching the temperature hold steady through the hottest afternoons. The work was slow and solitary, but it was not lonely. There was a companionship in the stone itself, in the knowledge that other hands had done the same work, in the way the lantern light fell across the fitted walls and made them glow like old honey. She found herself talking to the rooms sometimes, not aloud, but in her mind, telling them what she planned to do with each shelf and corner. She had never been the kind of person who spoke to herself, but she found it natural here, as if the silence was not empty but listening. Above ground, the drought worsened. The creek dropped to a trickle, and then to a chain of muddy pools where the cattle stood belly-deep in what little moisture remained. Jonas Crane's wheat began to yellow and curl, and he spent his days hauling water from a well that was slowing down like a tired clock. Other families along the ridge started talking seriously about leaving, about selling their claims for whatever they could get, and heading to Oregon or California, where the rain still fell in its proper season. Clara heard the talk at the general store when she went for supplies. She kept her mouth shut and bought extra nails. The orchard around the sinkhole was doing better than anyone expected. The young trees had taken hold in the cooler soil, and she watered them each evening from the underground channel, carrying bucket after bucket up the newly cut stairs and out through the second entrance. The trees drank deep, and their leaves stayed green, while everything else on the plain turned brittle and pale. She planted squash and beans in the spaces between the trees, not expecting a full harvest, but hoping for enough to supplement what she was storing below. The squash vines spread across the disturbed earth, their broad leaves shading the soil, holding moisture that would otherwise have evaporated before noon. It was a small victory, but she took it. The first real trouble came in August, on a night when the heat did not break after sundown. Clara lay awake on her cot, listening to the dry air move across the roof, waiting for a cool breath that never arrived. She rose before dawn, as always, and went down into the underground to check the water channel. The water was still there, still cold, still moving, but it was lower than it had been. Not by much, a finger's width, perhaps. She crouched beside it and studied the flow. The current seemed slower, the sound of it quieter. She dipped her hand in and felt the cold rise up her arm, but it was not the sharp cold it had been in July. Something had changed. She followed the channel upstream, past the first chamber, into the narrow passage that led to the cooling wall. The water still moved through the carved trough, but the depth had dropped further. She pressed on, into the vaulted chamber, where the water entered through the gap low in the eastern wall. She knelt and put her ear to the opening. She could hear the water beyond, but it sounded different, muffled, as if something had shifted in the earth above it. She sat back on her heels and considered. The channel came from a limestone seep to the northeast, according to the old writings. If that seep was drying up, or if something had blocked it, the entire system would fail. The cold storage would warm, the cooling basins would go dry. The underground rooms would become just rooms, without the steady breath of cold air that made them a gift. She took a lantern and a length of rope and went back to the second entrance, the one hidden in the northwest brush. She had not explored beyond the third chamber. The map showed a narrow fissure that extended northeast from the vaulted room, but she had not followed it. Now she would have to. She squeezed through the opening, holding the lantern ahead of her, the stone pressing close on either side. The passage twisted and turned, and the air grew cooler and damper. After perhaps 30 feet, it opened into a natural cavity, a low-ceiling space where the water channel emerged from a crack in the far wall. She could see where the water had been spilling out, steady and clean, and where it was now spilling less. The crack itself had narrowed. A piece of limestone had dislodged from the ceiling above and wedged itself into the channel, partially blocking the flow. Not completely, not yet, but enough to cut the volume by half. And if the stone shifted further, or if more debris fell, the flow would stop entirely. She stood looking at the blockage, her lantern held high. She could reach it with her hands if she stretched. She could try to work the stone loose. But the ceiling above the crack looked unstable, a web of hairline fractures spreading outward like cracks in a frozen pond. If she pulled the wrong piece, she might bring down the whole roof. She lowered her lantern and turned back through the fissure, her mind working. She would need timber to shore up the ceiling before she could clear the blockage. She would need help. And the only person she knew who had timber and might be willing to lend it was Jonas Crane, who had told her she would be gone by November. She climbed out into the August morning and stood on the brushy rise, looking across the valley at Crane's farm, where his wheat stood thin and pale, and his cattle gathered around a well that was failing. She thought about what it would cost her to ask him for help. She thought about what it would cost her not to. The water channel had been working for decades before she found it. If she let it fail now, she would have lost more than a cold room. She would have lost a system built by people who had trusted the earth and her to keep it alive. She was their descendant in that trust, whether anyone above ground knew it or not. She started walking toward the Crane farm, her boots raising small puffs of dust with every step. The morning sun was already fierce, and by the time she reached his lane, her shirt was damp at the collar. She found him in the barn, forking hay into a manger, moving with the slow economy of a man who had learned not to waste energy on hurry. He heard her footsteps and looked up, his face unreadable. "Miss Mayfield," he said, "this is a surprise." "I need timber," she said. "Heavy beams, 8 feet long, maybe 4 of them. I can pay you in labor or in kind, but I need them today." He set the pitchfork against the wall and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "What for?" "There is a water source under my land. It is feeding a system that someone built a long time ago. The system is blocked, and I need to shore up the ceiling before I can clear it. If I do not clear it, the water stops, and if the water stops, the cold storage fails. And if the cold storage fails, I lose everything I have been working toward." He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching like heat haze. Then he laughed. Not the tired laugh from before. This one was sharper, edged with something close to anger. "Water source, cold storage, a system. You have lost your mind, Miss Mayfield. You have been living alone too long out here, and that hole in your field has taken more than your corn. It has taken your good sense." She stood her ground. "I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to sell me timber. That is a fair transaction between neighbors." He shook his head. "I do not have timber to waste on a fool's errand. And even if I did, I would not sell it to prop up a hole in the ground that should have been filled in the day it opened." "You should be packing, Miss Mayfield, not building." She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back down the lane, feeling his gaze on her back like a weight. She did not look back. When she reached her own property, she went straight to the underground, to the second entrance, and stood in the vaulted chamber, listening to the water. It was still moving, but she could hear the difference now, a thinner sound, a note of strain. She had no timber. She had no help. She had only her own hands and the stubborn certainty that the people who built this place would not have let it die of neglect. She gathered her pry bar and her lantern and returned to the fissure. She would work the blockage loose without shoring. She would trust the stone to hold a little longer, and if it did not, she would be buried under the same roof that had held for decades. One more secret the prairie chose to keep. She entered the fissure, moved to the blocked crack, set her lantern on a ledge, and reached into the water. The cold bit into her arms. She found the dislodged stone, felt its weight, and began to work it free, millimeter by millimeter, while the ceiling above her held its breath. She worked the stone loose by feel alone, her fingers numbing in the cold water, her shoulders burning from the angle. The dislodged chunk shifted slowly, grinding against its neighbors, and she had to brace her feet against the wall to get the leverage she needed. The ceiling above her held, though she heard a faint creak, a whisper of stone settling. She held her breath and pulled. The stone came free with a sudden yielding, and water rushed past her hands, cold and urgent, surging into the channel with a sound like a long exhalation. She scrambled backward, pulling the stone with her, and lay in the narrow fissure for a moment, heart hammering, listening for the roof to fall. It did not. The water ran steady and deep again, the sound of it filling the passage like a promise kept. She stayed there until her breathing slowed, then crawled out backward, dragging the stone with her. She set it aside in the vaulted chamber, a trophy of sorts, and knelt beside the channel to watch the water rise. It came up to its former level within minutes, cold and clear, and moving with the same patient urgency it had shown before. She dipped her hands in and let the cold wash over her raw fingers. The pain subsided into a deep ache that she would feel for days. She did not mind. The water was restored. When she climbed out into the August evening, the sun was low and the air had finally softened toward coolness. She stood on the brushy rise and looked across at Jonas Crane's farm, where a thin column of smoke rose from his chimney. She thought about the timber he had refused her, about the laugh he had given her, about the way he had said, "fool's errand," as if the words carried their own finality. She did not feel anger. She felt something quieter, a patience that had been growing in her since the first day she descended into the sinkhole. She had done what needed doing without his help. That was enough. That would have to be enough. But the drought had not finished with the valley. The next week brought a wind from the southwest that carried no moisture, only heat and dust, and the faint smell of something burning far away. The creek turned to cracked mud. Jonas Crane's well began pulling air, and he spent 2 days digging it deeper, coming up with nothing but dry gravel. His wheat was beyond saving now, the stalks bending brittle and white under the sun. He took to sitting on his porch in the evenings, staring at nothing, his wife speaking to him in low tones that carried no answer. Clara saw him at the general store on a Saturday, the only day she allowed herself to rest from the underground work. She was buying salt and coffee, standing at the counter while the storekeeper, a thin man named Percy Hodge, wrapped her purchases in brown paper. Crane stood at the other end of the counter, buying nothing, just staring at the shelves, as if the answer to his troubles might be written on a tin can. He did not look at her, but Percy Hodge looked at both of them, and let the silence grow heavy. "Heard you've been planting trees in that hole of yours, Miss Mayfield," Percy said, his voice carrying the flat amusement of a man who had told the story a dozen times already. "Neighbors say you've got a whole orchard down there now. Apples, pears, maybe some peaches if the weather holds." "Apples and pears," she said. "No peaches. The frost comes too early for peaches here." "That's so." Percy wrapped the coffee and set it on the counter. "And how are those trees doing, with the creek dry and the ground cracking open?" "They are doing well," she said. She did not add anything else. Jonas Crane turned from the shelves and looked at her for the first time. His face was thinner than it had been a month ago, the lines deeper, the eyes carrying a redness that spoke of sleepless nights and too much sun. "You are still watering them," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "From where?" She met his eyes. "From the ground." He shook his head and looked away, the gesture carrying a weariness that went beyond disbelief. "You are a stubborn woman, Miss Mayfield. I will give you that. But stubbornness does not fill a well. It does not bring rain. It does not turn dust into bread." "No," she said quietly, "it does not. But it does keep a woman from leaving before the work is done." She paid Percy Hodge, took her package, and walked out into the late afternoon heat. She could feel their eyes on her back, Crane's heavy with something close to resentment, Percy's light with curiosity. She knew the story would spread. By evening, every family in the valley would hear that Clara Mayfield was watering an orchard from a hole in the ground, and the laughter would be a little sharper, a little more certain. She did not care. The water was still flowing, and the trees were still green. That night she sat in the vaulted chamber by lantern light, her journal open on the stone shelf. She had been keeping notes on the water channel, the temperature readings, the condition of the stored goods. The cold room held steady at 42 degrees, even with the heat above. The crocks of butter she had placed in the cooling basins had kept firm and sweet for 2 weeks now, longer than she had ever managed in the cabin. She had brought down half her harvest of dried beans, the squash from the Sinkhole garden, and a small cask of salt pork. The shelves were beginning to fill. She closed the journal and looked around the chamber, the stone walls glowing softly in the lantern light. This place had saved her, and she had saved it in return. It was a partnership she had not expected, but she accepted it with the same quiet gratitude she felt for the water that ran past her feet. The next morning she woke to a sound she had not heard in weeks. Rain. Not a sprinkle, but a hard, steady drumming on the roof, the kind of rain that fell in sheets and did not quit. She lay in her cot for a long moment, listening, not quite believing. Then she rose and went to the door, opening it to a wall of water. The parched earth drank it greedily, steam rising where the first drops hit the hot ground. She stood in the doorway, letting the cool mist settle on her face, and thought of the creek, of the well, of every dry thing in the valley that had been waiting for this moment. But the rain did not stop. It fell all that day and all that night, and by the second morning the ground could not drink any more. Water pooled in every depression, turning the lane into a ribbon of mud, filling the creek bed until it overflowed its banks. Clara went out to check the sinkhole and found it half full of brown water, the young trees standing in a shallow lake. The underground entrance was dry, protected by the overhang, but she knew the channel below would be running fast and high. She went down to check it, her lantern held high, and found the water in the trough running clear and steady, no different than before. The stone had absorbed the shock of the rain above, held it at bay. Whoever had built this place had known about drainage, had designed it to shed water away from the rooms. She climbed out and stood in the rain, soaking through her dress, and felt something like relief. The drought had broken. The valley would recover. But as she stood there, she saw a wagon coming down the lane, moving slowly through the mud. It was Jonas Crane's wagon, and he was driving it himself, his wife and children huddled under a tarpaulin in the back. He pulled up at her fence line and sat there, rain streaming off his hat, not looking at her. She walked over to the fence. "Mr. Crane." He did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "The well caved in. The whole thing. I was digging it deeper, trying to find water, and the walls gave way. It took my pump and most of the casing. I have nothing now, no water, no crop, no way to feed the stock through the winter." She stood in the rain, looking at his face, and saw something she had not seen before. Not shame. Not defeat. Something closer to bewilderment, as if the land had played a trick on him that he could not understand. She thought of her own well, shallow and unreliable, and of the water channel below that had never failed. She thought of the cold storage rooms, the shelves waiting to be filled. She thought of the promise she had made to herself in the domed chamber. "I have water," she said. He looked at her then, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Where?" "Below my land. There is a spring, a good one, fed by limestone. I have been using it all summer. It is clean and cold, and it does not run dry. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to be thirsty enough to find out." The rain fell between them, heavy and steady, filling the silence. His wife called something from the wagon, a question, a plea, and he turned his head toward her, then back to Clara. "Show me," he said. She led him to the second entrance, the one hidden in the northwest brush, and opened the stone slab. He followed her down the stairs, his boots slipping on the wet stone, his lantern casting a wavering light. When he reached the bottom and saw the first chamber, the fitted stone walls, the shelving, he stopped. He did not speak. He walked slowly through the rooms, past the cooling basins, past the water channel, into the vaulted chamber with its domed ceiling. He knelt beside the channel and dipped his hand in, held the water to his lips and tasted it. Then he sat back on his heels, his face unreadable in the lantern light. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "I do not know. Decades, maybe more. I found it when the sinkhole opened. The people who built it are gone, but they built it to last." He stood slowly, looking at the shelves, at the crocks she had stored, at the evidence of her labor. "All summer," he said, "all summer, while I watched my well go dry and my wheat burn up, you had this, and you did not tell anyone." "I told you," she said quietly. "You laughed at me." He did not answer. He stood in the center of the chamber, the water moving past his feet, the lantern light casting long shadows across the stone. "I have 5 children," he said finally, "a wife, a failing farm, and a well that collapsed on itself 3 days ago. I have no money to buy a new one, no timber to brace it, no hope of a crop this year. I did not come here to admit I was wrong. I came here because I did not know where else to go." She looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion in his face, at the way his hands hung at his sides as if they had forgotten what to hold. And she made a decision that would change everything. "You can draw water from my spring," she said. "I will show you where to build a pipe. And if you need cold storage for what little you salvage this season, there is room on the shelves. But there is one condition." He looked at her warily. "What?" "You tell the others. Every family on this ridge. Tell them what you found. Tell them I did not lie. And tell them that if they need help, they can come to me." The rain had stopped by the time they climbed out, the clouds breaking apart to reveal a pale afternoon sky. The valley was green and dripping, the air smelling of wet earth and renewal. Jonas Crane stood at the top of the stairs, his hat in his hands, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "I will tell them," he said. And he climbed into his wagon and drove home. That evening, Clara sat in her cabin, the door open to the cool air, and listened to the frogs singing in the wet grass. The water channel was running strong below. The shelves were filling. And for the first time since the sinkhole opened, she felt the weight of loneliness lift, just slightly, as if the ground had given her not only water and cold stone, but the beginning of something she had not dared to name. She did not know what would come next, but she was ready to meet it. The word spread slowly at first, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Jonas Crane kept his promise, though it cost him more than he had expected. He stood at the back of the church on Sunday morning, his hat in his hands, and told the gathered families what he had seen beneath Clara Mayfield's land. He described the stone chambers, the water channel, the shelves cut into the living rock. He told them about the cold that held steady through the hottest days, about the spring that had not faltered even when the creek dried to dust. The men looked at each other. The women whispered behind their hands. Old Man Hargrove, who had been farming the ridge since before the railroad came, laughed out loud and said Crane had been out in the sun too long. The service went on, but the murmuring did not stop. Clara, sitting alone on the women's side, felt the weight of 100 glances, some curious, some pitying, some sharp with the kind of amusement that cuts deeper than anger. She did not stay for the social hour. She walked home through the damp grass, the sky a pale September blue, and tried to let the stillness settle her. The orchard around the sinkhole had survived the flood of rain, the young trees standing straight and green, their leaves already turning toward the gold of early autumn. She had harvested the squash and beans from between the rows, and the cellar below was filling with more than she had grown herself. Word had brought a few visitors, not for water yet, but for curiosity. A woman named Esther Blake, whose husband had died the previous winter, had come to see the underground rooms with her own eyes, and had stood in the vaulted chamber without speaking for a full minute. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I have been praying for a place to store my preserves," she said. "The heat this summer ruined everything I put up. Every jar burst its seal." Clara had shown her the cooling basins and offered her shelf space. Esther had wept. That was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, others came, quietly, at odd hours, as if ashamed of their need. A young couple whose root cellar had flooded in the heavy rain brought a crock of pickled beets and asked if they might leave it. A widower with 3 small children brought a sack of potatoes and stood in the doorway of the first chamber, unable to find words. Clara showed them all the same courtesy. She led them through the rooms, explained the water channel and the temperature, and assigned each family a shelf section marked with a small chalk number. She kept no ledger, asked for nothing in return, but accepted what they offered. A jar of honey, a bundle of dried herbs, a promise of help with the spring planting. The shelves filled slowly, but they filled. The old men at the general store called it Clara's cave and made jokes about her living underground with the field mice. Percy Hodge repeated every remark he heard, adding his own seasoning. "They say she's got a whole kingdom down there," he told a customer one afternoon, loud enough for Clara to hear from the porch. "Thrones carved out of limestone, crowns made of old root vegetables." The customer laughed, and Clara walked in to buy her supplies with a face that showed nothing. She had learned to let the laughter pass over her, the way the wind passed over the prairie grass, bending but not breaking. But the drought's end had brought its own troubles. The heavy rains had swollen the Platte River to the north, and word came down the telegraph line that the water was still rising. A warm spell in late September melted the last of the mountain snowpack faster than the rivers could carry it, and the tributaries that fed the valley began to crest their banks. Clara noticed the creek behind her property rising day by day, the water turning brown with silt, carrying branches and debris from somewhere upstream. She checked the underground entrance every morning and found it dry, protected by the overhang and the natural drainage the builders had engineered. The water channel below ran clear and cold, undisturbed. On the first day of October, the flood came. It did not arrive as a wall of water, the way the old stories described. It came as a slow, relentless creep, the creek rising inch by inch through the afternoon, spilling over its banks, spreading across the bottomland, where the best hayfields lay. Clara watched from her porch as the brown water swallowed the fence line, then the lower corner of her cornfield, then the lane that led to the main road. By evening, the house across the way, the one belonging to the Hargrove family, was surrounded by a shallow lake that reflected the gray sky like a dull mirror. She went down to the underground and checked every room, every shelf, every crock. The water channel was running slightly faster than usual, but the level was steady. The stone walls showed no seepage. The air remained cool and dry. She lit an extra lantern and sat in the vaulted chamber, listening to the silence that was deeper than any sound above ground. She thought about the families who had stored their goods on her shelves, about the potatoes and preserves and dried apples that would last through the winter if the rooms held. She thought about what it would mean to them if the flood took everything above ground and they still had something left below. She closed her eyes and waited. The flood crested on the third day. The water reached the edge of the sinkhole, filling it to within a foot of the rim, but did not spill over. The young trees stood in water up to their lower branches, but their roots were deep and their trunks were strong. Clara waded out to check them, the cold brown water lapping at her waist, and found them standing firm. She worked her way back to the cabin, where the water had risen to the bottom step, but no further. The cabin was built on a slight rise, just enough to keep the floorboards dry. She hauled her remaining stores to the underground, carrying them through the second entrance, stacking barrels and sacks in the empty corners of the first chamber. Then she went back up and stood on the porch, watching the valley turn into a vast, quiet lake. The Hargrove house was under 2 feet of water by then. Old Man Hargrove and his wife had taken refuge in the loft, their livestock crowded onto a small rise behind the barn. Clara could see them from her porch, a dark cluster of shapes against the gray water. She thought about wading over, but the distance was too far and the current too uncertain. She lit a lantern and hung it on the porch hook, a signal. a small beacon that said someone was still here. On the fourth morning, the water began to recede. It dropped slowly at first, then faster, leaving behind a landscape coated in brown mud and debris. Fence lines were down. The cornfield lay flat, flattened and twisted. The road was a river of sludge. Clara walked out into the wreckage, her boots sinking into the soft ground, and began to assess the damage. The cabin was intact, the floorboards damp but not ruined. The orchard had lost 2 saplings, torn loose by the current, but the rest stood upright, their leaves coated in mud. The sinkhole was full of muddy water that would take weeks to drain naturally. But the underground was untouched. She descended through the second entrance and found the rooms exactly as she had left them. The air was cool, the lanterns dry, the shelves steady. The water channel ran clear. She walked through each chamber, touching the stone walls, feeling the solidity that had held against the flood above. The builders had chosen this site with care, had understood the land in ways that she was still learning. She stood in the vaulted chamber and let the gratitude settle into her bones. Jonas Crane appeared at her fence line the next day, his boots caked with mud, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had lost half his remaining livestock to the flood. His barn had collapsed. His root cellar had filled with water and debris, ruining everything he had stored. He stood on the dry ground near her cabin and looked at her with an expression that was no longer suspicion. It was something closer to awe. "The underground," he said. "Did it hold?" "It held," she said. He nodded slowly, staring at the mud-caked fields around them. "I have nothing left above ground. Nothing. My wife is in the house, crying over the jars she put up in July. We lost every one." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I have shelf space, and the cold is still holding." He did not answer. He did not need to. He followed her to the second entrance, down the stone stairs, through the passage, and into the first chamber, where the lantern light revealed the rows of shelves, the cooling basins, the steady movement of the water channel. He stood in the center of the room and looked around, his hands hanging at his sides. Then he knelt beside the channel, dipped his hand in, and let the cold water run through his fingers. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about this place. I told you would be gone by November, and here you are, with a kingdom under your feet, while the rest of us are drowning." She did not say anything. She did not need to. She led him to the empty shelf sections and showed him how to mark them with chalk. He carried the first load himself, a sack of potatoes that had been stored in his attic, the only thing he had managed to save. He placed it on the shelf with a care that surprised her, patting it once as if to assure it that it was safe now. As he turned to leave, he paused at the entrance. "The others," he said. "They will need to know. They will need this place." She nodded. "Tell them to come." The weeks after the flood brought a quiet that Clara had never known on the prairie. The valley was stripped clean, the fields lying flat and brown under a sky that had forgotten how to release rain. Families who had lost everything moved in with relatives or packed what remained and headed east. The general store did half its usual business, and Percy Hodge stopped telling jokes about Clara's cave. There was nothing funny left in the landscape. Clara spent her days in the underground, organizing the shelves, rotating the stores, checking the water channel for any sign of silt or slowing. The flood had proven the strength of the rooms, and now the community was beginning to understand what she had found. Esther Blake came twice a week to check her preserves, her face softening each time she saw the jars standing cool and unbroken. The young couple came with their infant daughter, asking if they might store a few sacks of flour, and Clara showed them how to tie a rope across the shelf to keep the sacks from toppling. The widower brought his 3 children, and Clara let them explore the vaulted chamber while their father measured the temperature with his hand against the stone. He had not smiled in months, but he smiled when the youngest child pressed her palm to the rock and announced it was colder than the creek in January. Jonas Crane kept his word. He drove his wagon to every farm within 10 miles, telling the story of the underground rooms, the spring that ran year-round, the woman who had planted an orchard in a hole in the ground while the rest of them were laughing. Some listened. Some shook their heads. Old man Hargrove, whose house had been flooded to the eaves, spat on the ground and said he would not trust his stores to a hole that had swallowed a cornfield. He had lost everything in the flood, his wheat, his barn, his root cellar, but he would rather eat dried bread than owe a debt to a woman who talked to the earth. Clara heard the remark from Esther Blake and said nothing. She had learned that the earth answered silence better than argument. The weather turned cold in late October, the first frost arriving on a wind that carried the smell of snow. Clara banked the cabin with sod and stacked firewood against the north wall. She checked the underground one final time before the freeze set in, walking through each chamber with a lantern, touching every shelf, listening to the water channel. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, colder than it had been all summer, but still above freezing. The water ran clear and steady. She allowed herself a small measure of relief. But November brought a cold that was different. It came not as a gradual settling, but as a hard, dry snap that turned the mud of the flood into iron overnight. The creek froze solid. The ground cracked. Clara woke one morning to find the cabin door frozen shut, and when she forced it open, the air hit her face like a blade. She went to the underground through the second entrance, her boots crunching on the frozen grass, and found the water channel running slower than she had ever seen it. The flow had thinned to a finger's width, and a thin skin of ice had formed along the edges of the trough. She knelt and touched the water. It was cold, so cold that her fingers ached instantly. She looked at the inlet where the water emerged from the crack in the eastern wall. A curtain of ice had formed across the opening, partly blocking the flow. She worked quickly, chipping the ice away with her knife, opening the passage. The water surged through, but it was thinner than before, the temperature of it only a degree or two above freezing. She sat back and thought. The cold was deep enough to reach into the earth, not just the surface. If the ground above the spring froze, the flow would slow further, eventually stopping. The storage rooms would lose their cold air, but worse, without the constant movement of water, the temperature would equalize with the surrounding earth and rise above freezing. The preserves would spoil. The potatoes would rot. The trust that the community had placed in her would collapse. She spent the rest of that day gathering materials. She had saved some of the timber that Jonas Crane had refused her, scavenged from the flood debris. She dragged it to the brushy rise and began to build a cover over the exposed section of the water channel where it emerged from the ground. She packed sod around the base, layered it with hay from the barn, and weighted it with stones. It was crude work, the work of a woman who had no time for elegance, but she hoped it would be enough to hold the cold at bay. That night, the temperature dropped further. She woke to find a pane of ice on the inside of her window. She dressed in the dark, lit the lantern, and went out to check the water channel. The cover she had built was holding, but when she lifted the edge, she found the water running even thinner, a trickle no wider than her thumb. The ice had formed again at the inlet, deeper this time, a solid plug that had nearly sealed the opening. She chipped at it with the knife, but the ice was thick and stubborn, and the cold was seeping through her gloves. She worked for an hour, stopping only when her hands went numb. The water began to flow again, but it was slow, reluctant, as if the earth itself was growing tired of giving. She sat on the frozen ground, her breath clouding around her, and felt the weight of everything pressing down. The underground had saved her through the drought and the flood. It had given her a purpose when the neighbors laughed. It had become the center of a small, fragile community that was beginning to trust her. And now it was freezing, inch by inch, and she did not know if she could stop it. The next day, Esther Blake came to the cabin, her face pinched with worry. "The jars," she said. "I checked them this morning. Some of the seals have started to buckle. The cold is dropping, Clara." Clara nodded. She had expected this. "I am going deeper," she said. "There is a part of the underground I have not fully explored. The map shows a lower passage, below the vaulted chamber. The spring must come from there. If I can find the source, I might be able to clear a path or redirect the flow before it freezes completely." Esther's face went pale. "You cannot go alone. What if something happens?" "Then you will know where to find me," Clara said quietly. She did not add what they both knew, that if the passage collapsed, there would be no way to reach her. She prepared carefully: 2 lanterns, a coil of rope, a long pry bar, a sack of candles, and a small pouch of dried meat and hardtack. She dressed in her warmest clothes and wrapped a scarf around her neck. She told Esther to wait at the entrance, to give her 1 day, and if she had not returned by the following morning, to fetch Jonas Crane and send word to the county seat. Then she descended into the underground for what might be the last time. The chambers were quiet, the lantern light casting long shadows across the stone. She walked through the first room, past the cooling basins, through the vaulted chamber, to the narrow fissure she had entered before to clear the blockage. But instead of turning toward the blocked inlet, she followed the wall to the far corner, where the map had shown a small mark she had not understood. A circle with a line through it, like an old symbol for a well. She crouched and ran her hand along the base of the wall. There, in the shadow, she found a crack wider than her hand, leading downward into darkness she had not noticed before. The air rising from it was colder still, but it carried a faint current, a movement that the upper chambers did not have. She lowered herself through the crack, feet first, holding the lantern above her head. The passage was tight, forcing her to turn sideways, her shoulders scraping the stone. After perhaps 15 feet, it opened into a space that made her stop. The ceiling was low, barely 4 feet high, but the room stretched out of sight in both directions. The floor was damp, covered in a fine silt that held the imprint of her boots. And in the center of the room, a pool of water, dark and still, reflected the lantern light like a black mirror. She knelt beside it and touched the surface. It was liquid, not frozen, and colder than anything she had ever felt, colder than the winter air above, colder than the ice in the channel. She held her hand in it for a moment, and the cold traveled up her arm like a current, reaching into her chest. She pulled her hand out and saw that the water beaded on her skin, clear and pure. It did not freeze. She looked at the pool again, and she understood. This was the true source, a spring that rose from deep beneath the frost line, too deep for the winter to touch. The water she had been using was only a branch, a diverted stream that ran close to the surface. But the main source was here, steady and unfrozen, and if she could connect it to the channel above, the cold storage would be saved. She looked around the low chamber and saw, along the far wall, a narrow channel carved into the stone, leading upward at a gentle angle. It was dry now, but the tool marks were clear. Someone had built this channel, dug it from the deep spring to the upper rooms, and then sealed it or abandoned it. She crawled over to it and ran her fingers along the dry stone. The channel was wide enough to carry a good flow, and it led in the direction of the vaulted chamber. If she could clear it, open the connection, the water would flow again, cold and steady, as it had for the builders. She set down the lantern and took up the pry bar. The work was slow, the space too tight to swing, forcing her to chip and scrape at the dry joints where the channel was blocked by fallen debris. Dust filled her lungs, her arms ached. The lantern burned low, and she replaced it with a candle, working by the small flame. She did not know how long she labored. Time had lost its measure in that low, cold chamber. Then the pry bar broke through. A rush of air, damp and cold, swept past her face. Water began to seep through the crack, slowly at first, then faster, running along the old channel, rising, finding its way. She scrambled backward as the water surged, filling the channel, spilling over the edge, running in a steady stream across the floor of the low chamber and out through the crack she had entered. She followed it, crawling back through the narrow passage, rising into the vaulted chamber, where the water was already flowing into the main trough. It ran clear and strong, deeper than it had been in weeks, the ice along the edges melting as the cold water mixed with the warmer air. She stood in the vaulted chamber, her clothes soaked, her hands raw, and watched the water rise. The sound of it filled the room, a steady, living sound, the same sound she had heard on the first day she entered, the sound that had told her the earth was not empty. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The water was running, the cold was holding, the underground was alive. When she climbed out through the second entrance, the sun was setting, an orange glow spreading across the frozen prairie. Esther Blake was waiting, her face lined with fear. Clara smiled, a small, tired smile, and said, "It is done." But as she spoke, she heard a sound from the direction of the Hargrove farm, a shout, sharp and urgent. She turned and saw a column of smoke rising from the Hargrove barn, orange flames licking at the dry wood. The fire was spreading, and the wind was carrying it toward the house. The smoke was black and thick, rolling across the frozen prairie in a column that seemed to reach the sky itself. Clara did not think. She ran. Her boots slipped on the hard ground, the cold air burning her lungs, the sound of the fire crackling and snapping growing louder with every stride. Behind her, Esther Blake called out, but Clara did not stop. She vaulted the fence line where the Hargrove property began and saw the barn fully engulfed, flames leaping from the roof, the heat pressing against her face even from 50 yards. Old Man Hargrove stood in the yard, his arms limp at his sides, his face blank with shock. His wife was on the porch of the house, her hands pressed to her mouth. The barn was gone, nothing could save it. But the house was still untouched, and the wind was pushing the fire toward it. Clara reached Hargrove and grabbed his arm. "The well!" she shouted. "Is it still working?" He looked at her as if he did not recognize her. "The well went dry in August, I told you that. Then we need water from my spring. I have a pump head in my shed. Get buckets, every bucket you own. Get your neighbors, I will bring the water." She ran back to her property before he could answer, her legs burning, her lungs crying out. She reached the shed, grabbed the cast-iron pump head she had salvaged from a broken well on the county road, and carried it to the second entrance. She descended the stairs and worked the pump head into the water channel, fitting it into a section where the stone had been cut to accept a pipe. She had never done this before, but she had seen it done 100 times, and the need drove her hands. She tightened the fittings, primed the seal with a cup of water, and began to pump. Water surged up the pipe, cold and strong, spilling onto the stone floor. She did not stop to let it settle. She grabbed a bucket, filled it, and carried it up the stairs, running toward the fire. Jonas Crane was there, and Esther Blake, and half a dozen other neighbors who had seen the smoke and come running. They formed a line from the second entrance to the Hargrove house, passing buckets hand over hand, the water sloshing cold and clean. Clara pumped and filled, her arms screaming, her back aching, the rhythm of the work drowning out every thought but one. Keep the water coming. The flames reached the eaves of the house, and the bucket line answered, dousing the wood before it could catch. The fire hissed and steamed, the smoke thickening, but the line held. Old Man Hargrove was at the end of the line, throwing water against the wall of his own home, his face streaked with soot and tears. It took 3 hours to bring the fire under control. The barn was lost, a black skeleton of charred timber smoking against the gray sky. But the house was saved, and the livestock that had been in the pasture were safe, driven to the far corner by the neighbors. When the last ember was drowned, the bucket line collapsed into exhaustion. Clara sat on the frozen ground, her hands blistered, her clothes soaked, her body shaking with cold and relief. Jonas Crane walked over and stood above her, and she looked at him the way the town sees them for the first time. "Miss Mayfield," he said. He held out his hand and helped her to her feet. "Miss Mayfield," he said again, and this time his voice was quiet. "You waited until we had nothing left to prove you were right. And then you gave us everything you had." He paused. "I have been a fool." She did not need to hear him say it, but she let him. And then Old Man Hargrove walked up. He was a different man than the one who had spat on the ground and said he would not trust a woman who talked to the earth. His face was hollow, his eyes raw, his hands still trembling from the work. He stopped in front of Clara and stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching like the prairie itself. "Clara Mayfield," he said, "you saved my house. My wife was inside. The water you brought came from a place I said did not exist. I told everyone you were a fool. I told them your cave was a hole in the ground that would swallow you whole." His voice cracked. "I was the fool. I was the one who could not see what was right in front of me. You have a gift, Miss Mayfield. You see what the earth is holding. You see what the rest of us are too proud to look at. I am ashamed of how I treated you. I am ashamed of how I spoke your name. And I am asking you, from the bottom of a heart that I did not know could still feel shame, to forgive me." She looked at him, at the soot on his face, at the tears that had cut clean tracks through the grime. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "You lost your barn, you lost your crop, you lost more than I can imagine. The fire did not come because of pride. It came because the world is hard, and it does not care about our arguments. What matters is that your house is standing and your wife is safe. What matters is that the water is still running. And what matters now is that we fill those shelves below with enough to carry every family through the winter." She turned to the gathered neighbors, their faces pale and weary in the fading light. "All of you," she said. "Anyone who has lost stores to the flood or the freeze or the fire, bring what you have left. The underground is open, the cold is holding, and the spring is running deeper than winter can reach." That night, Clara sat alone in the vaulted chamber, the lantern casting its soft circle across the stone. The water channel ran full and steady, the sound of it filling the silence like a whispered prayer. She reached down and touched the water, feeling the cold rise through her fingers, the same cold that had saved the preserves and the potatoes and the trust of a dozen families. She thought of the builders who had carved these rooms, who had understood the limestone and the water and the patience of deep earth. She thought of the winter ahead, the long months of cold and dark, the community holding together by the thread of a spring that never failed. She thought of the orchard above, the young trees sleeping under the frost, waiting for spring. And she thought of the man who had laughed at her, whose barn was ash, who had stood in the yard and called her a fool, and who had knelt in the end and asked for forgiveness. The prairie had a way of humbling everyone eventually. She had only been humble enough to listen to it first. She rose and walked through the chambers one last time, her hand trailing along the stone walls, feeling the cool solidity that had become the foundation of her life. In the first room, she stopped at the shelf where the Hargrove family's rescued stores now sat. A few sacks of flour, a crock of salt pork, a jar of honey that had been carried from the house before the fire reached it. She touched the jar, a small, warm gesture. Then she blew out the lantern and climbed into the frozen night. The stars were out, sharp and countless, the air so cold that her breath froze instantly and fell away as tiny crystals. She stood at the edge of the sinkhole, looking down at the dark shape of the water below, and thought of everything that had led her to this moment. The drought, the collapse, the laughter, the flood, the fire. The long hours of work below ground. The quiet conversations with Esther Blake in the vaulted chamber. The moment Jonas Crane first dipped his hand into the water channel and said nothing. The way Old Man Hargrove had said her name at the end, as if he was learning it for the first time. The orchard would grow. The spring would run. The shelves would fill. And the prairie, which had tried so hard to break her, had instead given her a home that nobody else had found because nobody else had thought to look. She turned and walked back to her cabin, the door closing softly behind her, the lantern inside casting a golden warmth across the room. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.